to be refuting the speech of Francine Simpson, and her proposition is that Donald Trump is in the running for the candidate of the Republican Party. However, the policies he's adopting are far more than just right-wing. Donald Trump is a fascist. Her secondary supporting claims are that, number one, Trump is establishing a majority or organic community, and she says that a man named Matthew Lyons says this. Number two, Trump is applying the racial scapegoating that once again Matthew Lyons declares as another trait of fascism to the Mexican community. And number three is that Trump is attempting to integrate his beliefs and control through mass organization, another trait of fascism. So she begins by saying that she will define fascism to us, and then she says that it's actually hard to define. So this weakens the argument immediately because you cannot claim that Trump is a fascist if the term is actually unclear to begin with. So she did present the article of which she found this information from Matthew Lyons. However, the lines that she quoted I was unable to find. So she does use two quotes from this person, once again Matthew Lyons, and I looked into him to find out who he is, and it says that he's an independent scholar and freelance writer, and he also co-authored Right-Wing Populism in America. So, independent scholars, freelance writers, this is something that anybody can just put out their opinion, so it's not necessarily credible, it's just one man's thoughts. And his information is going to be extremely biased because he believes that the right wings always go overboard. And actually Forbes says that, in fact, Donald Trump is not a fascist, and that so many people have been comparing him to Hitler and Mussolini are ignorant as to what the word fascism actually means. And Forbes goes on to say that for the most part we hear about style, not ideas, and we hear a lot about the vulgarity that he has and that the enthusiasm of the crowds and the threats to basic freedom. So just because we hear about that doesn't necessarily mean that he is a fascist. So claim two is that Trump is applying racial scapegoating that Lyons declares another trait of fascism to the Mexican community. She goes on to say that Trump blames Mexican Americans for wars on drugs, unemployment, and the overall fall of America, but she provides no evidence or quotes of him actually saying these hurtful things, so we can't just assume that it's true if we don't know. And just because Matthew Lyons says that it's a pillar doesn't necessarily mean that that this makes Trump a fascist. I actually have a quote of Donald Trump saying, "I love the Mexican people and I've always had a great relationship with the Mexican people." So if I read that, I don't think that he's using racial scapegoating because that's all I know. Her third one is that Trump is attempting to integrate his beliefs and control through mass organizations, another trait of fascism. She says that he calls for a mass deportation of Mexican immigrants and to have Muslim Americans register. And she says that the comparison is gravely close, if not exactly like the Jews in Nazi Germany. And, we can't assume once again that things will happen. He hasn't taken any action. This is him just going on and saying things. It's not necessarily, there's no action, so we can't assume this. And if he does want to control illegal immigration, that's great because in America we do need that. And, people coming from any country shouldn't just come in, it is illegal. And if he wants to do it, it's not him being fascist. So the Washington Post goes on to tell us that fascist is often a cheap, meaningless insult in U.S. politics, and that they give us also 4 reasons why Trump is not a fascist. The first one is Trump's message is very individualist, and that normally fascist leaders go up to say we should believe, rather than just I. So then that's one reason why he's not. And number 2 is that Trump doesn't oppose a democracy, and that he also does not oppose constitutional government or representative democracy, which we have seen that over history that historical fascists have all done this. The third one is that Trump doesn't support a fascist welfare state, and the last one is that Trump's positions are similar to other candidates in the running. So if he stood out significantly, then we could say that, oh, he's a fascist, but he doesn't, because for an example, Ben Carson, he wants to have a database that has everybody in the country rather than just discriminating the Muslims explicitly. But then that's even more control, and that's everybody, and that's even worse. But then Ben Carson isn't called a fascist, it's just Donald Trump. So in closing, the term fascist has been used too loosely over time. Donald Trump is not a fascist, he's simply a man who wants to make America great again. Okay, thanks.
All right, well, I thought you started off well citing the proposition, although you give the long part of the proposition, which includes a whole bunch of the introduction. You know, you don't need to do all of that.
I thought that it was that.
It's just the one point that Donald Trump is a fascist.
Oh, okay.
That's and everything else is superfluous, so it gets a little bit confusing. But you get to essentially that point in the speech, and we know where you're headed at that point. And you did a good job recapping what the advocates' claims were for those particular points. I thought you did a clear job signposting as you got to each of the points. So structurally, it's fine. You want to keep that up, by the way, everybody, because that's what you need to do in the debates later on. So we're trying to keep track of the arguments that are coming up. You want to remind us, here's the argument that the other person said, and here's my answer to that, so it's always easy to follow those arguments. I thought that you started off with a general criticism of Matthew Lyons, and that's okay. The idea that he might be potentially biased because he sees anybody who comes from the right wing as being potentially problematic. I think that that's maybe painting with a broad brush, but since they don't give much defense, and that's the only source that she's citing for that particular conclusion, I think that it's a reasonable press on his qualifications and his independence or lack of bias on that. I did think that you had a good follow-up, though, by suggesting that Donald Trump's not a fascist, and you gave very specific information from Forbes on this particular situation, and the style and vulgarity are not the characteristics that define fascism, that there's a false kind of assumption about what fascism is, and there's this general challenge to the lack of a specific definition that the advocate provides. I thought that that was a very good press to be making also. On your second point, you clearly summarize the point. You point out the false analogy that's being made. You suggest that you couldn't find the specific quotes. Once again, it's the same source that's being cited there. I thought that it was a good point to point out that the advocate didn't cite quotes from Donald Trump, and the one quote that we have from Donald Trump that specifically addresses those things is the one that you presented, which sounds a little self-serving. Oh, I love the Mexican people, I love Mexico, so on and so forth. I think there's a good explanation here that says Trump is pointing out that there are significant problems that are associated with our problems with immigration with Mexico, but that's not the same thing as saying a class of people are all evil, and the equivocation of the two is problematic. When you think of the fascists like Hitler, for instance, it wasn't, he was pointing to the immigration issue with Austria or with Romania or some other group like that, and said, and we got problems. He said, no, it's the Jews, And Trump sometimes uses the phrase Mexicans, but what he's talking about is we got Mexican drug lords and Mexican immigration that's creating these problems, and he's really talking about something specific, and he used the other descriptive term there. I thought that was a reasonable press on that particular point. I thought that your third point reasonably contains the counterclaims that you're presenting, and it's interesting that it comes from the Washington Post, which is not notoriously known as supportive of conservatives, which Trump claims to be, and it says, look, his message is individualistic, which is antithetical to fascism. He's not opposed to democracy, which, fascism is about consolidating power and not constitutional government, but power by authority and control. And, I thought that they did an interesting job kind of debunking the comparison that's being made there. So, and you did a good job presenting that kind of criticism. So those were pretty effective responses. All right, thank you.